Today, we're in the Ashley National Forest and headed up to the top of the Beehive State. Hi, I'm Skye Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today's episode is going to take us up to the top of Utah. But before we start this adventure, take a moment, click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates. Kings Peak is found in Duchesne County in the northeastern section of Utah. It's the highest peak in the Uinta Mountains and with a prominence of 6,348 feet, one of 57 ultra peaks in the United States. The peak gets its name from Clarence King, a geologist who explored this area, but more on him later. The Uinta Mountains are often divided into two sections, the eastern Uintas and the western or high Uintas. The range gets its name from a derivation of a Ute word, Uvutia, meaning pine tree or pine forest. It's easy to see with a quick look around why the range ended up with that name. These mountains truly are the rooftop of Utah, with more 11,000-foot peaks in the state than any other range. They are also the only place where you'll find any peak over 13,000 feet. They are the largest alpine area in the region, known as the Intermountain West. But wait, there's more. At one point in their history, the Uinta Mountains were glaciated, but that hasn't been the case for a very long time. These days, not only are they the highest mountain range in the contiguous United States with no modern glaciers, they are also the most poleward mountain range in the world to reach over 13,000 feet without modern glaciers. The Uintas are a fascinating set of mountains. While most of the mountain ranges in the Great Basin run from north to south, the Uintas actually run from east to west. Now, the creation of these mountains is complicated, and there's still quirks about these peaks that puzzle geologists to this day. But to keep things relatively simple, we'll break it down into two distinct events. The first part of this puzzle occurred 1.7 billion years ago, when the supercontinent Rodinia was forming. In that activity, two ancient plates were stitched together here, with that stitch line running on an east to west axis. This is known as the Cheyenne Belt, and it would be an area of weakness. Now, the second part happened much more recently, at least in geological terms, dating back about 34 to 70 million years ago, with an event known as the Laramide orogeny. Now, we've talked about the Laramide orogeny before in regards to Colorado. This is the mountain building event that gave us the Rocky Mountains. It also gave us the Uintas here in Utah. The uplift happening along that zone of weakness, the Cheyenne Belt. Now, when you look at these two parts on how the mountains were created, they also explain why some of the exposed rock here is so ancient, dating back 1.7 billion years ago. If these mountains had a higher elevation, it probably wasn't much more than what you find today, the uplift being balanced out by the rate of erosion. The complex nature of these mountains means there are many mysteries yet to uncover, including if the faults underneath them are still active. Humans have been living here for millennia. It's theorized the first humans to come to Utah arrived about 12,000 years ago. They were chasing after big game, to include woolly mammoths. They settled on the shores of Lake Bonneville, a massive paleo lake that took up a significant part of western Utah. Later on, one of the dominant cultures in the Utah region were a group known as the Fremont culture, their name coming from the Fremont River, where archaeological remains were first uncovered. They were an agrarian society living in farmsteads and cultivating maize, beans, and squash. One of their sites was identified in 1966 in nearby La Pointe, Utah. Known as the Caldwell Village, this site revealed a farming society that was quite capable of thriving in this environment. In a tragic bit of irony, this ancient farming village would later be destroyed by modern farming. In more recent times, these lands were the domain of the Utes, the Goshute, and Timpanogos peoples. They were predominantly hunting and gathering societies with strong familial ties, though the advent of the horse would change how they lived. These tribes would come into conflict with the United States as it expanded from the east. Prospectors, trappers, settlers, they all encroached on the Native Americans' ancestral lands, and violence would break out as the tribes moved to defend their territory. The influx of settlers would overwhelm the tribes living in Utah, and as the 19th century came to a close, they were forced onto reservations, and their numbers continued to dwindle. The arrival of the Mormons in Utah escalated this, with their belief that this was a chosen land given to them by God. The Mormons were unwilling to accept any claim by tribes already living in the region. The Mormons pushed the Native Americans to the fringes, taking the best land and resources for their own purposes. The Spanish were the first European power to lay claim to this territory as part of New Spain, though in truth it was in name only. There wasn't much in the way of exploration here until 1776, when two Franciscan friars, Atanasio Dominguez and Silvestre Velez de Escalante, set out to find an overland route from Santa Fe, New Mexico, to the Catholic mission in Monterey, California. Known as the Dominguez Escalante expedition, these Spaniards were the first Europeans to travel through this territory. They basically made a giant loop through the Great Basin. Here in Utah, they would actually encounter the Uinta Mountains, but they never crossed over them, instead opting to just travel along the southern front. Throughout the course of their journey, the Spanish kept detailed accounts. Escalante kept a journal of his travels, and another member of the expedition, Bernardo Miera Pacheco, arguably the most important cartographer of New Spain, went on to make several maps of the expedition's route. These artifacts would prove to be very influential, first to the American map makers who copied them, and then to future explorers who would use them. In addition, Escalante's writings painted quite a visual of this area, a mountainous land filled with timber and game, strange ruins of stone cities and villages, and rivers showing signs of precious metals. Despite the favorable description, the Spanish didn't make any concerted efforts to settle in this area. In fact, they actively prosecuted anybody found trading with the native peoples of this region. Of course, this hasn't stopped legends of lost Spanish gold mines and treasure from cropping up, with several supposedly located here in the Uinta Mountains. While the Spanish and later Mexican governments weren't really interested in this area, other groups of outsiders would be. And the next notable group of people to make their way here were driven by a more commercial force: fashion. The wearing of furs had long been a sign of wealth, and fur had long been a desired trading commodity. In the late 16th century, a new fashion craze took off: hats made from beaver fur. Beaver became the choice of hat makers because its fur made the best felt, and it took well to shaping. Up to the late 17th century, the creation of beaver hats was monopolized by Russia, who also controlled a majority of the supply of fur.
North America offered what seemed to be an unlimited supply of beaver pelts, and it quickly became one of the chief exports for the French and English colonies. Later on, once the United States achieved its independence, it too would look to capitalize on this trade.
The fur trade was very profitable and highly competitive. New sources of beaver were always in demand, and the focus turned west as beaver populations were eradicated to meet demand. By the first half of the 19th century, fur trapping efforts were making inroads into the Rocky Mountains and beyond.
In this part of the American West, fur trapping and trading efforts were led by the Hudson Bay Company, a British interest, John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company, and the upstart Rocky Mountain Fur Company that was organized by William Henry Ashley.
Ashley's enterprise would focus on this area, particularly the Green River Valley to the north of the Uintas. William Henry Ashley was an ambitious man who had already some success in the gunpowder business, politics, and with real estate. Now he'd turn his attention to the fur trade.
Ashley would start his venture with an advertisement in the St. Louis Inquirer. He was seeking 100 enterprising young men. They needed to be masculine, well-armed, and capable of trapping for up to 3 years. 180 men would answer the call. They became known as Ashley's 100 and were instrumental in the development of that American archetype known as the mountain man.
Beginning in 1822, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company launched expeditions out west to trap and gather pelts. They took a different approach to pelt collection. Instead of having the native population do the trapping and bring the furs to a central point such as a fort, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company relied on a brigade system, with its own trappers bringing the furs to an annual rendezvous.
For the next decade, the mountain men would roam through these lands trapping beaver. For future settlers, though, they would also leave detailed accounts of their exploits and document the land they worked on. This knowledge would prove to be invaluable when the U.S. government started to show more interest in this region.
You can still see their effect reflected on maps. The city of Provo was named after Etienne Provost, and Ogden after Peter Skene Ogden, two Canadian fur traders who worked the area. Others would etch their names into the annals of American history, such as the legendary Jim Bridger and Jedediah Smith. The beaver fur trade collapsed in the 1840s. Demand for fur had been dwindling in Europe. Overtrapping had practically wiped out the population of both the Eurasian and North American beavers. Tastes were changing, with fur falling out of fashion and silk taking the forefront as a hat-making material. The last rendezvous would be held in 1840.
While the mountain men explored some of the area, they were mostly here to make money. It would be another individual who would really bring this place to life in the minds of the American public.
John C. Fremont was a controversial American explorer in the first half of the 19th century. Born in Savannah, Georgia in 1813, Fremont initially served with the U.S. Navy before taking a lieutenancy with the U.S. Army's Corps of Topographical Engineers in 1838. He headed west shortly thereafter.
Fremont would lead 5 expeditions through the American West, covering territory that would later be divided up into 11 different states. His epic treks earned him the nickname Pathfinder. He would pass through Utah on multiple occasions, but his second and third expeditions would spend the most time here, and they would prove to be particularly influential for Utah's future.
Fremont's secret weapon was his wife Jessie, the daughter of Senator Thomas Hart Benton. Jessie had taken an interest in her husband's work and quickly took to the role of recorder, detailing his explorations, humanizing them, and adding a bit of romantic flourish. These excerpts quickly became popular with an American population hungry for details of the American West and helped spur westward expansion.
While the mountain men were here reaping the bounty from the land, and Fremont and his fellow explorers were charting it, neither group ever really planned on staying here. But their work would set the stage for the next group of people who would call Utah home.
The settlement of what we know as Utah really took off with the arrival of the Mormons. The Mormon religion had its roots in the Second Great Awakening, a Protestant religious revival movement that swept across the country in the first half of the 19th century. The movement as a whole was a response to the secularism in the Age of Enlightenment, with an emphasis on a return to the values and teachings of Jesus Christ. In reality, it saw the start of numerous offshoots of Protestantism. Unlike its peers, though, Mormonism set itself apart and went on to be one of the only successful American religious traditions of the 19th century. It was founded by Joseph Smith in 1827, when he declared that he had unearthed a set of gold plates describing God's tenets for the true church on earth.
Many of these movements would court controversy, and Mormonism was no exception. What put it at odds with American society was its views towards marriage, in particular traditional biblical marriage, and that meant polygamy. Now, that wasn't the only issue. There was also the fact that the Mormons tended to maintain separate communities, but they'd vote as a bloc, and so wherever they settled, they'd upset the balance of power, much to the chagrin of their neighbors. And then there was also Joseph Smith's prophecy that God would bring an end to all nations. To some of the powers that be, that bordered on treason.
These beliefs put them at odds with local and state authorities, and the Mormons quickly found themselves not welcome. As the Mormon movement grew, they continued to move west, eventually arriving in Illinois, Missouri. Controversy and conflict followed them wherever they established colonies. In 1844, Joseph Smith, while awaiting trial, was murdered in jail by a mob. A power struggle ensued amongst the Mormons, but eventually leadership fell to Brigham Young. He proposed the Mormons do their own version of an exodus and settle beyond the reach of Uncle Sam. He had a perfect place in mind for them to go.
Young had been an avid reader of Fremont's exploits out west. A particular interest to him was Fremont's descriptions of the Great Salt Lake and its surrounding environs. The geographic, economic, and agricultural potential of this location made it seem like a promised land that was quite capable of supporting a large group of people. On top of that, it was in the middle of nowhere, and nobody was doing anything with it. And perhaps most critically at that time, it was still part of Mexico.
The route they took became known as the Mormon Trail. For a majority of the journey, it followed the same course as the established Oregon Trail, though the Mormons often traveled on the north side of the Platte River to avoid conflicts with other travelers. At Fort Bridger, the trails separated, the Mormon Trail turning southwest to head towards the Great Salt Lake. Over the next 20 years, 60,000 Mormon settlers traveled along this route. In late July 1847, Brigham Young brought the first of his followers to the shores of the Great Salt Lake. They settled in a buffer zone between the Ute and Shoshone tribes and quickly built up a community. Their ranks swelled as more Mormons joined them. Unfortunately for the Mormon settlers, Uncle Sam was not far behind. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican-American War resulted in a significant transfer of territory. The United States now stretched coast to coast.
Brigham Young wasn't about to be stymied by such a little thing of a change of country ownership. He would pursue a new plan, this time statehood. Having their own state would give the Mormon religion a fair degree of autonomy. And the reality of the situation was the Mormons were already here.
The Mormons proposed a state called Deseret, which was a massive block of land taking up a majority of the land the United States had just received from Mexico. Congress saw things a bit differently and in response carved out the Utah Territory. Established by the Compromise of 1850, it was not the state of Deseret, but it was still a vast swath of land consisting of parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada. The eastern boundary, for the most part, ran down the Western Continental Divide in the Rocky Mountains. The western boundary was the current border of the state of California and Nevada.
In the mid-19th century, it was the federal government that controlled mainly what happened in the territories. The president, with the consent of the Senate, was the one to appoint the territorial governors and other territorial office holders. These positions, though, they didn't actually require the consent of the people living in the territory.
President Millard Fillmore appointed Brigham Young as the Utah Territory's first governor, and the Mormons were quick to fill the offices of leadership for the territory, oftentimes the seniority of the position in line with their role in the church. This also tended to exclude any non-Mormons from having any role. This became a point of contention as accusations of theocracy started to crop up and fueled the fear that Mormons would declare independence, splitting the United States in two.
From the Mormon point of view, after years of persecution, it made sense to them that they'd only be able to exercise their religious freedom if they were ruled by members of their own religion. Hence the inclination of the Mormons to take civil matters to church and ecclesiastical courts instead of federal ones.
There was still the practice of polygamy as well. This issue would become one of the biggest sticking points between the federal government and the Mormon religion. Things came to a head in 1857 with the inauguration of the 15th president, James Buchanan. Buchanan believed this degree of autonomy was a threat, and more than a few people in the federal government believed the Mormons were loyal in name only. Buchanan replaced Brigham Young as territorial governor with his candidate, Alfred Cumming. He also ordered 2,500 troops to the Utah Territory to build a fort and enforce the law under the discretion of the new governor. The Mormons had no real knowledge of the Army's mission, and based on earlier experiences, they feared the worst and prepared accordingly. When the Army got closer, the Mormons launched raids on Army supplies. These events went down in history as the Utah War. Over the winter, a standoff occurred between federal forces and the Mormons. By 1858, though, political pressure in Congress forced Buchanan to find a solution.
In the end, the Mormons accepted Buchanan's appointed governor in exchange, though, for amnesty for the destruction of federal property. The Utah War may have been resolved relatively peacefully, but it was not inconsequential. This area suffered. Civilians were killed, property destroyed, crops ruined. Mormon power and isolation may start dwindling in Utah, but the mistrust that was there continued, and it would shape how the state of Utah would come to be. Over the course of the next several decades, Utah would see its territory dwindling, much like colonial Maryland did hundreds of years before, parts of it going to its neighbors. But whereas colonial Maryland's happened under the crown, Utah's, well, was by the direction of the U.S. Congress.
Over the next several decades, the Utah Territory was whittled down, starting with the discovery of precious metals in both the east and west. In the east, territory that became modern Colorado was sliced away after the discovery of gold in the Rockies. That loss of territory also took Utah's chance of being in the 14er Club. In the west, an even more substantial chunk of territory was lopped off with the discovery of the Comstock Lode. This section would go on to become the state of Nevada. As additional gold strikes were discovered, Nevada found itself on the receiving end of even more Utah territory. The common factor in all these decisions was the lack of trust in Mormon loyalty towards the federal government.
There was an exception to this, though, and it has to do with Utah's missing northeast corner. That section of land wasn't given away due to political reasons, but geographical ones instead, particularly due to the Uinta and Wasatch Mountains and the L shape that they create. In the minds of Congress, it made more sense to give that portion of land to Wyoming, who could access it easier, than to keep it with Utah, who would have to contend with crossing two ranges in order to reach it.
While the mountain men, Fremont, the Mormons, and others had mapped the area, it wasn't comprehensive by any means. After the U.S. Civil War, and with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, the United States was now in a position to fully exploit its frontier. But to do that in an organized fashion meant having reliable maps and an inventory of what was actually there. Building off the earlier Pike and Fremont expeditions, a young geologist named Clarence King proposed a grand survey that would reveal the geologic and natural history of the region on the main line of the Transcontinental Railroad. King was only 25 at the time, but he had already gained invaluable experience while surveying in California and the Sierra Nevadas. King's pitch was audacious, but he had the vision and charisma to convince Washington, D.C. that not only was it worthwhile, but that he was exactly the kind of person to pull it off.
King was persuasive enough not only to get himself named as the U.S. geologist for the Geological Survey of the 40th parallel, but also to secure the initial funding and, more importantly, continuing funds as the survey progressed. No small order in the post-Civil War period. As for the survey itself, it would map and record a 100-mile band along the 40th parallel, starting in California and finishing in Wyoming. It was the first of 4 great American Western surveys.
For the next 12 years, King led this effort. The survey itself would be in the field for 6 of it. At times, it was a grueling endeavor, crossing rough and rugged terrain, dealing with extreme weather and other challenging events. In 1869, they cut across Utah, surveying the Great Salt Lake, the Uinta and Wasatch Mountains, and the Green River.
At its conclusion, the survey would total up to 7 full volumes of material and include a topographical and geological atlas. It would prove notable. It became the model for the other 3 great surveys. It also improved the public's confidence in the federal government and its ability to carry out projects of this caliber. It also had a huge impact abroad, bolstering the reputation of American science and scholarship at a time when it was desperately needed. As for Clarence King, well, he would help go on to found the U.S. Geological Survey and serve as its first director.
King's survey wasn't the only one to trek through the Uintas, though his survey's findings did prove to be the most comprehensive. 2 of the other great surveys, led by John Wesley Powell and Ferdinand Hayden respectively, also trekked through here, but even after gaining a more thorough understanding of the area, it remained rugged and remote, though eventually ranchers started to crop up, the Uinta South Basin proving ideal for grazing cattle.
Settlement here would take a slightly different approach. For starters, it wasn't actually driven by the Mormon Church. The county, as originally established, was to serve as a reservation for the Ute people. But in 1887, the passage of the Dawes Act, the area was opened up to further homesteading by other settlers.
The isolation of this region also drew in unsavory characters, outlaw gangs looking for easy scores for cattle rustling, with plenty of areas to bolt to when eluding the long arm of the law. One of the most notorious of these outlaw gangs that roamed through here was Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch, also known as the Hole in the Wall Gang.
Robert Leroy Parker was born in 1866 in Circleville, Utah. He's better known to history as Butch Cassidy. Cassidy began his life of crime in his teenage years, first as a cattle rustler, but it wasn't long before he decided to move up to bigger scores. Along with it, he started to assemble a group of people of similar minds, willing to help pull off these heists.
The Wild Bunch really took off in 1896, and for the next several years put together the longest successful stretch of bank and train robberies in American history. The gang operated over a wide territory from the Dakotas, Nevada, Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and of course here in Utah. The Uinta Mountains were traversed more than a few times as Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch moved from hideout to hideout. Despite a successful stretch of villainy, many of the members ended up in prison or the graveyard.
Butch Cassidy and Harry Lombaugh, also known as the Sundance Kid, are thought to have met their end in a shootout down in Bolivia, which is where they had fled to after a string of robberies in Argentina. But even that ending is up for debate. We really don't actually know what happened to Butch and Sundance, but we do know that they fade out of history around the beginning of the 20th century. There's still a legend that parts of the Wild Bunch's ill-gotten gains are hidden in various spots around Utah.
The days of the Wild West were coming to a close, and the government slowly established more control over the region. Utah achieved statehood in 1896, 46 years after its creation as a territory, but only after it had banned polygamy. More locally, Duchesne County was established in 1915.
The Uinta National Forest would be established in 1897, originally as the Uinta Forest Preserve, part of a larger effort by President Grover Cleveland to preserve the forest and grazing lands of the country after decades of overuse.
In 1908, President Theodore Roosevelt established the Ashley National Forest, separating 1.4 million acres in Utah and Wyoming from the larger Uinta National Forest. It's named after General William Ashley of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. The High Uintas Wilderness was established in 1984 with the passage of the Utah Wilderness Act. While Kings Peak has always been the name of the state high point, the actual mountain with that name has changed. The original state high point was thought to be the mountain now named South Kings Peak, with an initial measurement of 13,498 feet. The real highest point wouldn't be revealed until 1966, when satellite imagery determined the unnamed peak to the north was actually taller. The new high point became Kings Peak, and the old one was renamed South Kings Peak. Interestingly enough, it also upped the elevation of the former high point, adding another 14 feet to it, but just not enough to retain its state high point title.
The hike up Kings Peak, well, it's gonna be a long one. There are multiple routes to the summit, but all of them require a concerted, dedicated effort. For most folks though, you're going to want to start over at Henry's Fork Trailhead.
Kings Peak is often in the discussion of hardest non-technical state high point. A lot of this has to do with the distance. It's a 25-mile round trip from trailhead to summit, and that's on the easy route.
Now, technically, Kings Peak can be done in one very long day, but you're going to want to be in marathon shape to do it, because that's the distance you'll be covering to get there and back. We're going to break it up, though, over the course of 3 days. Our first leg will be from the trailhead, Dollar Lake. Second day will be the ascent up Kings Peak. And our third day is the return to the trailhead. Before you step off, make sure to sign the register. Let's get to it.
The first leg of the hike is relatively straightforward and easy. You hike down Harney Trail towards Dollar Lake on a well-marked, well-traveled trail. For this hike, you'll want to dress accordingly. Once past Dollar Lake, there will be little respite from the sun, so a hat and plenty of sunscreen will be in order. Also, weather here can change quickly, particularly in the afternoon, so proper clothing will also put you in good stead. Water past Dollar Lake can be a bit tricky, so make sure you bring a filter or another way to purify, and top off when you can. Finally, trekking poles come in handy as well. Once you get to Dollar Lake, it's pretty easy to find a spot to put up your shelter if you are overnighting. Remember, leave no trace. If you pack it in, pack it out. Once past Dollar Lake, the real work begins. First, you'll head up to Gunsight Pass, a good place for a quick break.
Once you get up to the top of Gunsight Pass, you have a choice to make. You can either go the longer, easier route by dropping into Painter's Basin behind me. You will lose some elevation, but you will get back on the other side as you climb up to the ridge, and from there go to Anderson Pass. Or you can take a shorter, more technical route known as the shortcut, which goes over through that way. And that is the route we're going to take today.
At this point, you can see most of your remaining route. You'll head west across the open flat area up to Anderson Pass. From there, you'll turn left and begin the main climb up Kings Peak, picking your way across the boulders as you head up to the summit. Once at the top, you'll be able to take in the high Uintas wilderness in all its glory and catch a glimpse of some of Utah's other 13ers, to include South Kings Peak to the south of where you stand.
And here we are on the summit of Kings Peak, the highest point in the state of Utah. With an elevation of 13,528 feet, this is the 7th highest state high point in the USA. I'm Skye Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Rooftops of America. Before you go, leave a comment and click those like and subscribe buttons below. And I'll see you soon.